My name is Lila Renford, and the moment my father tilted his head and gave that small, amused grin, something in me dislodged so abruptly that it felt like a piece of the world I'd lived in my entire life cracked in half. I had only called to ask about the family trip I'd spent $36,000 arranging, a trip I foolishly believed might be the thing that stitched the four of us back together after years of drifting and me doing everything I could to keep us afloat. His tone wasn't hesitant, it wasn't apologetic. He delivered the sentence casually, as though he were commenting on the weather rather than severing something quietly inside me. "We already went last week. It was only for family." His voice carried a strange lightness, the kind people use when they're amused by how little effort it takes to cause a wound. I didn't respond at first. I couldn't. My mind kept replaying the words as though they were lines from a script read too quickly. Only for family. As if I had never belonged in that definition at all. All the nights I shuffled money around to help them, all the plans I'd pieced together, all the hope I'd tried to hold. The meaning dissolved in one simple phrase. It didn't take long for me to realize what had happened. Someone had changed the reservation documents, switched the dates, exchanged my name for theirs. The entire trip I built, my time, my savings, my intention, had been used to draw a circle I wasn't allowed to step inside, not even when I was the one who paid for it. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand explanations. Sometimes silence reveals the truth more effectively than any confrontation could, and the truth was unmistakable. I wasn't being pushed out that day. I had been out for a long time. I just didn't see it until then. 2 months passed quietly, at least on the surface. The first shock faded into something more muted, something that lived beneath my ribs and pulsed whenever I thought about what had happened. When the next message came, a request for help with rent, delivered with the same familiar expectation, it was like watching a pattern carve itself across my phone screen. I read the text twice. My father's earlier words drifted back to me, cold and sharp. This time, I returned them in the calmest voice I could manage. Only for family. I didn't raise my tone or lace it with bitterness. I didn't have to. The boundary was already there. I had just never named it. Before I tell you how he reacted or what unfolded after I hung up, you should understand where all of this began. My life in Dallas had settled into a kind of practical repetition. After my marriage ended, I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in an older building that smelled faintly of cedar whenever the sun warmed the hallway. I found work as a financial operations analyst for a mid-tier software firm. From the outside, it looked like I had everything sorted: salary, benefits, predictable workflow, a badge that unlocked a glass door with my name printed underneath. Inside, though, my life was measured in routines so consistent they sometimes blurred together. Mornings at my desk, evenings at the gym, meals reheated from containers, sleep arriving whenever an episode of something ended. My parents lived nearly 3 hours south in a town that once thrived when the local mill was still operating. My father, Marion Renford, had worked maintenance there for most of his adult life until a spinal injury forced him into early medical leave. My mother, Alina, bounced through part-time jobs that lasted a few months each. My younger brother, Eric, spent years enrolling and dropping out of community college courses, gathering vague dreams that never lasted long enough to turn into plans. At first, helping them felt natural, almost instinctual. When my father's truck needed repairs, I gave the mechanic my card number without hesitation. When the electric bill threatened to shut off their power, I made the online payment before my mother even finished explaining. When Eric fell behind on rent, twice, I sent him enough to catch up. It didn't occur to me that a pattern was forming. I thought I was doing what anyone with the means would do for the people who raised them. The requests didn't come dramatically. They slipped into my life the way humidity seeps into the Texas air, subtle, persistent, hard to notice until it becomes the environment you're breathing in. $100 here, $300 there, sometimes more, always paired with urgency, overdue insurance, necessary car repairs, medical fees. My phone would light up with their names, and before I even opened the messages, I'd feel the familiar tightening in my chest. Eventually, in a moment of late-night exhaustion, I did something telling. I opened a new spreadsheet and created a tab titled Family Support. I began logging every transfer, dates, amounts, reasons. It was the only language I truly understood. Numbers, order, clarity. Seeing the total climbing gave me the illusion that I was still in control, though a part of me already sensed that I wasn't. To make room for the support, I trimmed corners quietly. I canceled my weekly therapy appointments, telling myself the copay wasn't worth it. I brought leftovers to work instead of joining coworkers for lunch. When friends invited me on weekend trips or dinners out, I politely declined, saying I was saving for something important. I tried to ignore how conversations with my family had shrunk. Our phone calls, once filled with stories and laughter, now lasted just long enough to segue into a financial request. "How are you?" had become a throat-clearing warm-up before a new need was mentioned. Each month, the totals on my spreadsheet rose. Each month, the hollow feeling in my chest deepened. But I pushed the discomfort down because acknowledging it felt selfish. They needed help. I could help. That was the story I told myself. Simple, linear, justifiable. The truth, of course, was more complicated. Working in finance meant I was often the person warning clients when a risk was becoming dangerous, when an investment had turned into a liability. Yet I ignored those same warning signs in my personal life. I treated my family's dependency as though increasing my contribution was the only rational response. The more strained things became, the more I gave. I didn't know then that generosity without boundaries becomes its own form of slow harm. Then, one night, while staring at the glowing total on the family support sheet, another thought appeared, tentative at first, then louder. Maybe the issue wasn't that I was giving too much. Maybe the real problem was that giving had become the only thing tying us together. That thought stayed with me for days. It followed me into work, into the grocery store, into moments that should have felt light. The more I sat with it, the more it pressed on me. And that was when the idea formed. Maybe a shared experience could help us reset everything. Maybe if I created something meaningful for all of us, we could step out of the transactional loop we'd fallen into. A trip. That's where my mind landed. Not the kind of vacation people take for fun or relaxation. I imagined something symbolic, something that might remind us what it felt like to simply be around each other without tension, without money hanging in the air like a shadow. I planned it the way I planned my work projects, methodically, with a dozen browser tabs open at once. I researched flights, resorts, car rentals. I compared options on a spreadsheet labeled destinations, listing pros and cons the way I would for corporate budgeting. There were mountain towns, lakeside cabins, coastal hotels. Eventually, I settled on a quiet seaside resort, known for long stretches of empty shoreline and calm weather. Neutral, predictable, safe. Once the choice was made, everything moved quickly. I booked spacious rooms. I chose flight times that wouldn't require anyone to be up before sunrise. I reserved a vehicle big enough for all of us and bought tickets for several group activities. Nothing extravagant, just gentle, simple things I hoped might bring small moments of connection. Each reservation nudged the total higher, climbing past numbers that would have made me wince under different circumstances. But this wasn't about frugality. It was about repairing something, or trying to. When the final confirmation screen appeared, the total sat just over $36,000. I hesitated for a moment, then clicked confirm. A strange mix of dread and relief settled over me, like watching a bridge burn behind me while hoping the path ahead led somewhere better. I messaged my family the itinerary. It was long and detailed, outlining flights, hotel check-in, daily activities. A small, hopeful part of me expected excitement, or at least a question. My father replied first. Got it. 2 words. No punctuation, no acknowledgement of the effort, the cost, the intention. But I kept imagining the trip anyway. I pictured us sitting near the water, eating meals without tension. I imagined walking along the shoreline together, letting the sound of waves flatten the noise that had built between us. It was a fragile hope, but it was hope nonetheless. As the departure date approached, the silence from my family grew heavier. No questions about packing or logistics, no follow-up at all. I mistook the silence for trust. I didn't consider the possibility that decisions were being made without me, in quiet spaces where I had no presence. Then the morning arrived, the day everything shifted from uneasy hope to cold clarity. I called my father to confirm their departure time. He answered with a tone so casual it made my stomach twist. He told me they had already gone, that they'd taken the trip last week, that it was a family trip, so naturally they hadn't told me, only for family. For a second, my mind tried to fabricate an alternate meaning. Maybe I misheard. Maybe he meant something else. But no, the finality in his voice left no room for interpretation. After the call ended, I sat at my desk staring at nothing. Eventually, muscle memory pulled me to my laptop. I opened the reservation portal and typed in the confirmation codes. The adjusted itinerary loaded slowly, as though giving me time to brace for impact. My name was gone. The guest list held only theirs. The dates had been changed, details rearranged, everything repurposed for a trip I funded but was never meant to join. It wasn't the loss of money that hollowed me out. It was the realization that something I had been trying so desperately to mend had already snapped months, maybe years, earlier. The days that followed blurred into mechanical routine. I went to work, answered emails, contributed to meetings. My body functioned on autopilot while my mind circled the same quiet questions. How long had they seen me as a resource rather than a relative? How had I missed it for so long? Every evening when I returned to my apartment, the truth settled a little deeper. A few days later, I reopened the family support spreadsheet. I hadn't looked at it since I booked the trip. The total glared back at me, a rising tide of numbers documenting a history I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Rent assistance, utility payments, emergency transfers. Looking at the rows felt like reading a ledger of silent expectations. Then came the new message. Rent's late again. Can you send something today? No mention of the trip, no mention of what they had done, as though my absence from their vacation had been as irrelevant as the money they continually assumed would appear. For the first time, something inside me didn't yield. There was no anger, just clarity, clean, unshakable. I typed a short response, only for family. After that, silence. But not the kind that precedes another request. This one felt different, as if some internal mechanism had finally stopped turning. I spent the evening making changes I should have made long before. I opened my banking app and canceled every recurring transfer, insurance payments, rent subsidies, utilities. Each cancellation generated a soft confirmation message, and each message felt like reclaiming a small corner of my life. Then I changed passwords, added layers of security, locked down accounts that had once been dangerously accessible. The next morning, I called a locksmith. A technician named Jonah arrived that afternoon. He installed a reinforced deadbolt and a small camera above my doorway. He showed me how to access the live feed, how to monitor motion alerts, how to store recordings. When I closed the door after he left, the click of the new lock sounded deeper, sturdier, final in a way that made my chest loosen. A few quiet days passed. I assumed the changes hadn't been noticed yet. I was wrong. One afternoon, while cleaning the small dining area of my apartment, a notification chimed sharply from my phone. Motion detected at your door. I opened the camera feed. 4 figures stood in the hallway. My father, my mother, my brother, and a man in a charcoal suit holding a leather briefcase. My father stood closest to the camera, arms crossed in a way that felt unnecessarily authoritative. My mother kept her gaze low, shifting uneasily. My brother scrolled through his phone as if he'd rather be anywhere else. The man with the briefcase adjusted his tie and stepped toward the camera. I walked to the door slowly, not from fear, but from the strange weight of inevitability. I opened it only as far as the chain allowed. The suited man introduced himself as a representative acting on behalf of my family. His tone was clipped, formal, rehearsed. He said they were concerned about my abrupt withdrawal of financial assistance. He said they wanted to ensure I was making decisions from a sound and stable place. He said they were prepared to take legal steps to secure what they believed they were owed. He handed me a stack of documents heavy enough to feel deliberate. The implication was unmistakable. They intended to force me, through court orders if needed, to continue supporting them. I looked at each of their faces. My father's expression lacked even a trace of conflict. My mother's eyes flickered with something, regret maybe, or fear. My brother didn't look up, and inside myself, instead of the expected hurt or anger, I felt only a kind of quiet certainty. I returned the packet to the lawyer, told him politely that any legal action should be filed formally and addressed through the proper channels, then closed the door before he could respond. That night, a letter arrived in my mailbox, outlining their intention to pursue legal intervention regarding my financial obligations. The phrasing was clinical, but the entitlement behind it felt almost palpable. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I simply placed the letter on my table and understood, fully, finally, that the people I had spent years trying to support no longer saw me as a daughter, only a provider. The next morning, I contacted my friend Maya, someone who had known me long enough to notice changes I couldn't articulate. We met after work at a small cafe. I didn't dramatize the visit or the threats. I laid out the facts the way I might present a quarterly analysis. Her expression darkened as she listened. Then she slid a business card across the table and told me it belonged to an attorney she trusted deeply, Colin Mercer. I scheduled a consultation the same day. Colin's office was quiet, efficient, intentional. He listened as I explained everything: the years of financial support, the sudden escalation, the attempted legal pressure. He took structured notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back and told me this wasn't unheard of. Families sometimes conflate generosity with obligation, especially when dependency becomes ingrained. He explained what we needed: financial records showing the payments were voluntary, employment documents establishing my stability, messages demonstrating expectation rather than agreement, medical documentation confirming I was mentally sound. I spent the next several days gathering everything: bank statements, pay stubs, emails, text exchanges. The more I compiled, the clearer the pattern became: years of unreciprocated giving presented in clean rows and columns. When the court date was set, I felt something inside me settle. Not anxiety, not dread, but readiness. The morning of the hearing arrived wrapped in pale gray light. The courthouse felt coldly structured, but the predictability of the environment calmed me. My family sat across the aisle, my father stern, my mother timid, my brother distant. Their attorney delivered his narrative first, painting me as unstable, erratic, emotional. He suggested my cessation of financial support was a symptom of psychological decline. Then Colin stood. His voice was steady, precise. He presented my employment history, my financial independence, my performance reviews. He laid out the transfers I had made as acts of voluntary generosity, not contractual obligation. He explained the absence of any evidence supporting their claims. When the judge asked me why I stopped sending money, I told the truth plainly: because support had turned into expectation, expectation into entitlement, and entitlement into depletion. Because I had given until I no longer recognized myself in the arrangement. I didn't mention the trip. Some wounds don't need to be displayed to prove the truth. The judge's ruling was brief. There was no legal basis for their petition, no obligation, no requirement. Case dismissed. When the gavel struck, the sound felt like something heavy being cut loose. I didn't look back at my family as I left the courtroom. I didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, distance formed naturally. My parents moved into a smaller apartment. My brother found work. Life continued without me subsidizing it. And for the first time, I built something quietly and entirely my own. I relocated to a brighter apartment. I learned new recipes. I read books I had abandoned years earlier. I walked for the sake of walking, not because I needed to clear my mind from stress. And gradually, a life began to take shape, not built from obligation, not measured in generosity, not defined by what others needed from me, but grounded in the simple, steady truth of belonging to myself. After the courtroom, the world didn't explode into melodrama. There were no sweeping cinematic scenes of reconciliation or vindication. Life simply folded itself into new, quieter patterns, less ornate, more honest. That shift didn't come from a single grand moment. It arrived in small, almost imperceptible increments. A Tuesday morning where I made coffee just for me, an hour spent reading novels I had shelved for years, a Saturday when I walked without an agenda and noticed the way light pooled on the corner of Magnolia Street. Those were the seams where change stitched itself into my life. The first practical change I made was the one I had always meant to make but had let fear postpone. I started therapy again. I called a counselor named Rami, who had office hours late enough for me to get there after work. His room smelled faintly of citrus and copying paper, an odd scent combination that somehow felt safe. Our sessions were not about dramatics. We spoke of patterns, about how generosity can calcify into expectations, about the quiet epidemic of caretaking that wears people thin. He helped me practice saying no in my head until it stopped sounding like a betrayal and started sounding like an honest answer. Therapy didn't erase the hollow the trip had carved out of me. It taught me how to live in it without letting it define me. It taught me to notice the difference between obligation and choice and to weigh my kindness against the cost to myself. I learned that the edges of a boundary could be kind if I drew them with respect for myself and for others. Not long after the court case, my brother texted. He'd found work stocking shelves at a grocery warehouse. It wasn't glamorous, but his tone contained a pragmatic steadiness I hadn't heard before. He asked if I could lend him a small amount to cover the transportation deposit for the job. For the first time in years, I didn't transfer money automatically. I paused. I thought about lending him the money, but only if he agreed to a plan. Pay it back over 3 months, document his progress, share his work schedule so I could not excuse him from being accountable. He balked at first. It's easier, of course, to accept help without structure. But after a few messages, he agreed. Helping with conditions felt awkward at first, like adding a wrinkle where there had always been smoothness. But the wrinkle was honest. It acknowledged that I cared, but also that their recovery was not my job to finance indefinitely. He kept his promise. He called once a week to tell me about his supervisor, the awkward fist bumps in the break room, the way his legs ached at the end of his shifts. The calls were small, human things. They did not erase the past, but they wove a dimmer, more truthful connection. My parents reacted differently. My mother called less, then more, then less again. Sometimes she sent long messages at 3 a.m. about nothing and everything, recipes she'd tried that were gross, the neighbor's loud cat, a television show she thought I would like. She was not the kind of person who could gracefully occupy the gray area between needing help and being independent. She oscillated. My father's calls were the hardest to navigate. He scored the apologies like small, deliberate offerings at first, carefully packaged, safe. I could hear the practiced restraint in his voice. "Lila," he would say, "I'm sorry if things went wrong. We were wrong." The words were light and fast, like birds flitting between trees. I accepted some of them, not all. An apology without action is a door left ajar rather than shut. The lawyer's letter about potential legal action became a memory that hung without drama on the wall of my life. My parents moved into a smaller place. My brother's job smoothed his mornings. These were consequences of the shift, and there was no triumph in watching them. If anything, the distance that grew between us felt less like punishment and more like an allowance, space for us each to remake the contours of our own lives. One November morning, brisk with the kind of clarity that made people feel foolish for wearing scarves too early, my mother called me in a voice I hadn't heard since before everything unspooled. It was thinner, the syllables spaced out as though she was trying to arrange herself into sentences. She told me Dad had fallen at the grocery store and bruised his hip. She said she'd managed to get him home, but that the pain hadn't improved and that she didn't know what to do next. It arrived like the old script: ask for help, assume it will come. But this time, when she pleaded, there was a different sentence threaded through it, one I had rehearsed in therapy until it felt possible. I can help, I said. I can drive down for a few days, help with appointments, but I'm not going to assume financial responsibility for everything. Tell me what you need. Her relief was immediate and visible even through the phone. She said she understood. She said thank you. She also said quietly, I'm sorry, as though apology itself could be a currency. 2 days later, I drove south. The town looked smaller than I remembered, its main street shortened by shuttered storefronts and the same mural of the mill now fading at the edge of town. My parents' apartment was neat but small, the kind of space where furniture arranges itself into a choreography of necessity. My father sat rigidly on the couch, wincing with each shift. He greeted me not as an authority, but as if we were awkward strangers sharing an elevator. The stay was bumpy in ways that had nothing to do with the hip. My father's pride turned into defensive, curt answers. My mother oscillated between gratitude and sudden irritability, perhaps because the reality of having to depend on someone again peeled back layers of shame she had kept hidden. I did what I had come to do, scheduling a doctor's appointment, coordinating physical therapy, making sure the prescriptions were filled. There were moments on that trip where something trembled in the space between us. My father would stop mid-sentence and study me, as if measuring whether the face across from him might hold a verdict. Once, when he thought I wasn't listening, he said, almost to himself, maybe I got used to things being easier. I didn't respond. I let the phrase settle. It sounded like a small, genuine fracture in the armor he'd spent years building. On the last evening, after a quiet dinner with barely used jokes and overcooked pasta, my father asked me to sit with him at the small window that looked over the parking lot. The lamplight painted his cheekbones, and his hands, calloused and sure for years, trembled slightly as he wrapped them around a mug. I know I was wrong, he said. The words were blunt and slow. I should have told you. I should have. I don't know how to say it right. You never do, I thought. But I didn't say that. Instead, I let him have the space to speak. I didn't understand how much you did, he went on. I thought, maybe selfishly, that it was what daughters do. But I see you differently now. I don't want you to feel like you have to carry us any longer. He sounded older in that moment, smaller and wearier and more human. I told him that I heard him. I accepted the apology in the only way I knew how, by staying and letting the conversation be what it was, a small softening in a wall we had both maintained. That trip didn't heal everything. It did something quieter. It introduced a permission slip into our relationship. It allowed each of us to be less performance-driven. We didn't return to our old rhythm overnight, but there was a newly carved channel for future conversations. It was conditional and fragile and real. Back in Dallas, the rhythm of my own life continued to expand in unexpected directions. At work, a promotion that had seemed like a distant possibility became real. I was offered a role overseeing a small team, an opportunity to shape processes and mentor people starting out in the field. It felt like recognition of my skills and, more importantly, like a chance to use my experience for others without losing myself. I accepted, and with it came responsibilities that forced me to draw clearer lines between work hours and private time. I also found myself volunteering once a week at a community center. The commitment was modest, 2-hour shifts, helping adults with resume writing and basic budgeting. I'd been nervous about it. afraid it might replicate old patterns, but it turned out to be one of the most grounding decisions I made. The people there didn't know me as their daughter or their lender. They knew me as a person with skills willing to share them. It allowed me to practice generosity in ways that felt reciprocal. When someone thanked me, I felt it go both ways. And then there was someone new. His name was Aaron, though I didn't find that out immediately. We met at a potluck hosted by a friend of a friend, that tired trope of urban social life where people bring food and hope their conversation lasts. We sat across from each other at a picnic table coated in glitter from someone else's craft project and found ourselves laughing over a shared disdain for overly earnest small talk. Aaron wasn't dramatic. He was quick with a calming observation and had a way of asking what felt like the right kind of questions, curious but not invasive. He worked as a teacher and had the patient sort of energy that made you forget to check your phone. Our early dates were the kind that gently edged into more coffee, where the sunlight found the small worlds on the table, a museum visit where we argued about which gallery deserved the most attention, and long walks where he noticed things I had stopped seeing. He accepted my work hours, my therapy schedule, and even the thorny bits I brought to the surface without trying to fix them. He offered presence without pressure, which felt like the opposite of so much I'd known before. We didn't move fast. There were moments, tiny ones, where old ghosts tested my new boundaries. My family would call, or messages would pile up, or an unexpected request would arrive. Sometimes the echo of the old dynamic tugged at me with that familiar guilt. But Aaron's calm presence served like a counterweight, steadying my choices and allowing me to act from intention rather than reflex. Months slid into a version of normal I hadn't realized I wanted. My brother came to visit once, proud of the extra hours he'd earned and the small raise that finally made his life feel less precarious. He hugged me the way people hug when they mean it, and for the first time in a long while, the embrace felt free of the earlier economy of obligation. We shared dinner and really talked, trading small confessions and laughter over dishes we both loved. I kept returning to the idea that boundaries, once celebrated, hardly looked like the sharp edges people feared. They were more like lanes on a road, guidelines that help everyone travel smoother. When you put them in place, the world on either side didn't collapse. It shifted. People found different routes. Some joined you, some didn't, and some simply moved on. There were setbacks. A letter arrived from a collection agency claiming past due utilities my parents had failed to pay. A late-night call from my mother when she felt suddenly panicked about something trivial. A weekend where my father wanted to borrow a sum that would strain my comfort. Each time, I paused. I called my lawyer for advice once, not because I anticipated court again, but because sometimes a third-party voice makes your position feel less like an accusation and more like a principle. I learned the art of compromise, offering help that healed rather than enabled. Once, when my parents needed to replace an aging refrigerator, I agreed to help fund half the cost on the condition that they contribute the rest by adjusting their monthly grocery spending and cut a subscription they never used. It felt bureaucratic and small, but it worked. They made the adjustments. The deal respected my limits while acknowledging their needs. And then, one crisp, late winter morning, a deeper surprise arrived, not through a letter or a court document, but through a gesture my father made without fanfare. He invited me to his workshop, the small garage where he used to tinker, full of tools and the slow smell of oil he had always loved. He'd been working on restoring an old radio. He wanted me to see it. I agreed. The garage looked like home, scattered parts, old screwdrivers in a wooden box, a calendar with a fox on it turned to March. He showed me the radio gently, explaining the tiny repairs with a light in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. For a long minute, we didn't speak about money or courtrooms or hotels. We spoke about the mechanics of sound and how the radio's speaker had a delicate voice when you coaxed it right. It was ordinary, almost boring in the most comforting way. "I'm learning," he said finally, not making a show of it. No performance, no heavy apology, just a small statement of intent. I believed him enough that day to feel my throat loosen. It wasn't a convertition, it was the kind of ordinary progress that does not require proof. Reconciliation, I'd learned, rarely looks like the climactic scene in films. It grows in domesticity. A call returned, a promise kept, a lunch shared where the conversation doesn't circle back to old wounds. It was not always tidy. There were missteps and mishearings. There were afternoons when I'd feel exhausted by the maintenance of relationships and wonder if I had traded too much for too little. But the gains were real. They were measured not in a ledger, but in sustained human contact. A year after the courtroom, I found myself sitting at a small outdoor table near my apartment, watching the city inhale and exhale. Aaron sat across from me with a slow cup of coffee, and we watched a group of kids chase each other down the sidewalk. The air smelled faintly of rain. I reached for his hand because it felt right, because it had become natural to connect not as a utility, but as two people wanting to be nearer. I still kept my spreadsheet. It hadn't disappeared. It lived in a folder, a relic of an earlier version of myself. Sometimes I opened it to remind myself how far I'd come. The numbers still mattered in their own way, as markers of decisions made and choices reclaimed, but they no longer governed the days or dictated the worth of my family. They were a tool I could use without letting them become the sum of my life. My parents called sometimes. My father's voice had softened in a way that suggested humility rather than calculation. He asked my opinion about small things more than he asked for money. My mother, when she called late at night with minor crises, often followed her plea with a thank you and a note of self-awareness that hadn't been there before. Those changes were imperfect and sometimes fragile, but they were steady. There were mornings when I still woke layered with the residue of what happened, a phantom guilt that suggested kindness always required sacrifice. Those mornings were the ones I met with care. I journaled, I called my therapist, I took walks and let the city's rhythm normalize the pressure in my chest. The life I had reconstructed was not a fortress. Too much of my past taught me the danger of walls. It was a living space with windows and doors that now had locks, with rooms that sometimes filled with company and other times stayed intentionally private. I had learned the difference between being present and being used. I had learned how to give without losing myself. One summer afternoon, much like the calm days I'd once planned to spend on the shore with my family, I went to the coast with Aaron and a small group of friends. We spread towels on the sand and watched the tide draw its lazy patterns, and I thought of the seaside trip that had once meant so much. Instead of rage or regret, a kind of gentle grief passed through me, an honest human ache that something I'd wanted to fix had broken beyond repair. Alongside that grief, an odd gratitude arrived, for the lessons learned, for the life reclaimed, for the fact that I could now look at the shore and see a horizon that belonged to me again. When the sun slanted low and painted the water in molten gold, I closed my eyes for a moment. I imagined the family I had once tried to hold together by footing bills, making reservations, and smoothing out their burdens. I forgave the versions of us that had failed, not because they had asked, but because forgiveness allowed me to move forward without dragging hurt behind me like a tether. The future still felt open, uncertain, threaded with possibilities. My brother would likely wobble in and out of stability, as young adults often do. My parents would likely slip into patterns from time to time, because habits have long memories. But there was a difference now. The roles we played had been renegotiated. I was no longer the default solution to every problem. I was a daughter who could be asked, not an ATM waiting on the countertop. If you were to ask me what I learned most from the entire ordeal, I would tell you this. Generosity without boundaries becomes a debt, and debt, no matter how willingly assumed, always accrues interest. Kindness is not measured in dollars. It is measured in choice. You can love someone and still choose not to be their scaffolding. You can set limits and still be kind. You can carry your own life with careful intention, and when you do, you might discover that others will learn to do the same. There were still moments, quiet ones, that cut me to the bone. A photograph posted to social media of my parents, smiling at a restaurant downtown without mention of the earlier estrangement. An unexpected request in the middle of the night. A pang when my brother forgot to call. Those moments arrived like weather, predictable, sometimes stormy, sometimes benign. I no longer let them dictate the climate of my inner life. Instead, I nurtured the small things that anchored me. The way the light pooled on the floor in the late afternoon, the sound of the kettle when it finished boiling, the look Aaron gave me when I said something honest without excuse, the steady rhythm of work that allowed for predictable rest. In their ordinary textures, I found a kind of wealth I hadn't known I could afford. And sometimes, when the city was quiet and the dust motes spun in the sunlight, I'd take out the old itinerary and the spreadsheet, trace the numbers with an idle finger, and let myself feel the whole arc of what had happened. The intention to repair, the betrayal that followed, the legal fight, the retreat, the slow re-knitting of life. I'd breathe in, exhale, and then fold them away. They were chapters, not definitions. Life, in the end, kept moving, messy, awkward, tender. That was the greatest miracle of all.